Welcome, everyone. My name is Ted O'Connell. I'm one of the authors of Crush Step 1, the ultimate USMLE Step 1 review. This is the second edition of the book, and we're going through it chapter by chapter. This is part 3 of the cardiology chapter. We're going to start by talking about the Frank-Starling curve. The Frank-Starling curve shows that the force of contraction of the myocytes is dependent on the initial length of cardiac muscle fiber, the degree of stretch, which is determined by the preload. More venous return equals more preload. Therefore, larger ventricular end diastolic volume, more muscle fiber stretch, and a stronger contraction. It ensures that if more blood returns to the heart, then the heart can pump that extra blood by increasing stroke volume. Contractility is the force of contraction at a given preload, and therefore increasing preload does nothing to contractility. Increased contractility would be a whole new curve, such as the positive inotropic effect curve shown in figure 6, not moving along the existing curve. With increased preload without change in contractility, it would move to the right on the same curve. Contractility, or the inotropic state, can increase with beta-1 stimulation or positive inotropes, such as digitalis, and can decrease with negative inotropes, such as beta blockers, with heart failure, or with acid-base disturbances. Now let's talk about the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle is described by one round of diastole and systole. During this time, the ventricle will fill, during diastole, from the preload offered to it by the atrium by flowing through the respective atrioventricular valve. The left atrial pressure is shown by the black line at the bottom of figure 8-7. The atrium will contract near the end of filling to help push more blood into the ventricle, called atrial kick. After filling, the atrioventricular valve will close, and the ventricle will contract and eject the blood out of the pulmonic in the right heart or aortic in the left heart valve into the pulmonary artery or aorta, respectively. A closer look at the cardiac cycle and the heart sounds will follow. When the left ventricular pressure is higher than the aortic pressure, the aortic valve is pushed open by the pressure gradient. This valve remains open until the left ventricle has ejected the stroke volume for that beat. A similar waveform, but with lower pressures because the pulmonary circulation has lower pressure than the systemic circulation, would be present for the right heart. The venous pressure is usually shown as jugular venous pressure, which is an estimation of right atrial pressure. A similar waveform occurs for the left side of the heart as well. The normal venous waveform has A, C, and V waves, as well as X and Y descents. This is depicted in figure 8-7b. The A wave represents the atrial kick, or atrial contraction, for the right atrium, which helps fill the ventricle, but also transmits some pressure back to the jugular veins. The C wave is the next upward deflection in pressure, corresponding to contraction of the right ventricle, causing the tricuspid to bow inward toward the right atrium, transiently increasing pressure. The right atrium, having finished contracting, is now relaxing and filling, causing the X descent during relaxation, as blood moves from the venous system into the empty atrium. The V wave occurs during venous filling. At first, it can be seen that atrial pressure decreases with relaxation, the X descent, but subsequently rises as the atrium becomes full. Now the filled right atrium can move the blood into the right ventricle. During ventricular diastole, the tricuspid valve opens, and the blood in the atrium will empty into the right ventricle, leading to the Y descent. Atrial fibrillation leads to loss of the A wave because there's no coordinated atrial contraction. Tricuspid stenosis will lead to a prominent A wave because the atrium will be contracting against a valve that cannot open sufficiently, and the atrial kick will cause an increase in venous pressure because the blood cannot go into the ventricles. AV regurgitation, whether mitral or tricuspid, will show a CV wave where there is a large upward deflection in pressure between the C and V waves. This is because during ventricular contraction, some of the blood will move back into the atrium, causing a large rise in pressure. A stenotic aortic valve would manifest by larger ventricular pressures than aortic pressures, because the aortic valve, which cannot open fully, cannot receive all the blood that the ventricle is attempting to pump into it, owing to the increased resistance through the valve opening. Figure 8-8 demonstrates a pressure-volume loop, which occurs during each cardiac cycle. The loop shown represents the left ventricle only. Follow each step described in the figure. Isovolumetric contraction. At the end of diastole, the ventricle is filled, the end diastolic volume, and the mitral valve closes. The aortic valve is already closed. The ventricle begins to contract against the closed mitral and aortic valves, increasing pressure but not changing volume, because both valves are closed. This is isovolumetric. When the ventricular pressure exceeds aortic pressure at point 2, the aortic valve will open. Ventricular ejection, points 2 to 3. The aortic valve opens at point 2. The blood leaves the ventricle into the aorta. Once the blood is ejected, the aortic valve will close at point 3 on the curve, as the aortic pressure is now greater than the ventricular pressure. The blood remaining is the end systolic volume. Recall from earlier that the stroke volume is simply the end diastolic volume, filled ventricle, minus the end systolic volume, emptied ventricle. Therefore, this curve also shows the stroke volume. With increased afterload, the ventricle has to generate higher pressures to open the aortic valve. It is working harder, pushing against a higher pressure, causing a decreased stroke volume and increased myocardial oxygen demand. With increased contractility, the heart will generate a larger stroke volume. Thus, even with the same end diastolic filling volume, there will be a smaller end systolic volume. Isovolumetric relaxation, steps 3 to 4. The aortic valve is closed at point 3, and the mitral valve is still closed, and the ventricle now relaxes. Because there are no valves open, the volume inside the ventricles cannot change. It is isovolumetric. Finally, ventricular filling from steps 4 to 1. Once the pressure in the ventricle is lower than that of the left atrium at step 4, the mitral valve will open and fill the ventricle. The amount the ventricle fills, the end diastolic volume, is dependent on the preload, the amount of blood in the left atrium waiting to fill the ventricle, as well as the compliance of the ventricle and the presence of the atrial kick. That's the end of this section. In the next, we will pick up with heart sounds and murmurs.